Search and rescue is a job that is definitely very, very taxing. Many are actually volunteers, and their stories can be very sad and sometimes very creepy. Today, I'm going to be sharing some pretty creepy stories while people are out on search and rescue missions. If you have a story you would like to share in a future video, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that keep this channel going. Now, without further ado, let's get into these creepy stories from search and rescue operations. Growing up as a kid, I always knew I wanted to help people. It was just something that stuck with me through my life as an adult. Most kids growing up want to be a firefighter, policeman, or some familiar line of work. As we grew older and learned of the realities of the world and some jobs as well as life, our interests change. In my case, my interests never really did. I knew from an early age I wanted to be a police officer, and that never changed. More specifically, I worked with the sheriff's department. I live in Northern California, and as I'm sure you've heard before, it is quite different up here from SoCal. There are still cities and college towns, but there are also quite a bit of woods. As someone who wished to help others as much as possible, I also trained and volunteered for our local search and rescue. Police work is a rewarding thing and at times a grim thing. The same could be said for those who volunteer for search and rescue. It isn't needed or used all the time, but when it is needed, there is always that thought in the back of your mind that this could go either really well or really bad. Anyway, in the winter of 1992, we got called out to a search for a missing person. The person was a 7-year-old girl who had been missing for quite a few days recently from a camping site that the family frequented on vacations throughout the year. The couple usually rented a cabin during the winter, but one morning, when they went to get their little girl up for breakfast, they realized she was missing. At first, they thought she might have just went outside for a walk with their dog, but when they found the dog still inside and their daughter nowhere to be found, like any parent, they grew worried about their child. The first day of the search, we brought out some dogs and had them search for the girl by scent as we followed. We had several volunteers and we spread out hoping that we'd be finding this girl fast. Most successful search and rescue efforts are completed within the first 24 hours. If it goes beyond 24 hours, that usually means the person missing is in a hard to find or hard to reach area, or in some sad instances, dead. A few hours into the search, we found a hopeful sign. It was the little girl's shoes. This was hopeful as that meant we were on the right path, and being as she was a little girl, she couldn't have traveled very far, especially without shoes. The search continued and we pushed harder to find this girl. It was about an hour after finding the shoes that it began to rain heavily, and the wind picked up. As the rain fell, you could begin to see somewhat worried looks on the search team faces. The rain could be good or bad depending. Right now, currently, on hand, the dogs could track a scent through the rain. More often when it was light rain, but during a heavier rain in a storm like this, it would be harder as often the scent is blown away or simply obscured by the winds. It was when it was clear our dogs had lost the scent that we decided to push forward without them. We continued in the general direction the dogs were initially following, and spread out the search from there. It was a couple of hours later that we found a teddy bear lying on the ground. After verifying with the family that it was their little girl's based not only on the description but a name we found on the bottom of the left foot of the bear, we knew it was increasingly more likely this girl had been kidnapped. Kidnapping isn't necessarily a common occurrence in search and rescue situations, as often the person missing is simply lost or trapped somewhere. It isn't something we jump to as a possibility without sufficient evidence to back that up. We called in backup and began treating the search differently now. The fact that there was a good chance this girl had been abducted meant this changed the way we should search and where we would search. We had to treat it more as a missing person case now. We needed to be ready for a fight if need be. should we catch up to whoever had the girl. The fact was, there was no way this little girl had moved as fast as she was. There's no way. We continued our search, but we also notified other law enforcement to keep an eye on the roads in case the possible kidnapper had gotten out of the woods and was trying to leave the area. Considering the way we were headed, we didn't think this was the case just yet, but we wanted to contain any possible escape. 1 hour turned into 2, which turned into 4, and I remember feeling that fear begin to creep up in my stomach. It was about 5 hours after finding the bear we came upon a clearing and found a toy ring. The rain had stopped by this point, and we had our dogs on the search again. It was upon finding this ring that the dogs began barking wildly and running. As we followed it, it began to become apparent that we were getting close. Now came one of the scariest parts. Would we find the little girl, or would we find a body? It was only 5 minutes later we would get an answer to that question. Our weapons drawn, we moved in as our dogs gave chase. We could hear movement, and it was fast. It wasn't long before we found the girl. She seemed unharmed physically, and outside of being hungry, she seemed happy to see us. I can't tell you the relief we felt when we found her alive. She told us about a man who came up to her window in the night and asked for help looking for his dog. She explained she had been told not to talk to strangers, but the idea that someone's dog might be missing kind of overrode that logic. She left and went with the man, afraid of an innocent animal being in danger. We were lucky we found this girl alive and unharmed. Parents, I cannot stress enough that you keep a close eye on your children when camping, even if you are in a cabin. In this case, there wasn't much the parents could have done short of staying in the same room with their child, but it's always important to keep a watchful eye on your children regardless. I would add, if you stress stranger danger to your children, which all parents should, you should always go over several scenarios and occasionally go over these scenarios again, even testing your children from time to time to make sure it's ingrained in them. That all said, the child was safe in this case, and I'm grateful we were able to find her in time. As for the kidnapper, we did catch up to him and arrest him. He had thankfully given up on continuing his kidnapping of the little girl around the time he heard us closing in. Finding the girl alive filled me with an immense relief and pride. It was a good reminder of why I'm grateful every day to be involved in law enforcement. Also, before you go judging the parents or child too harshly, keep in mind this was back in the early 90s, and as silly as it's going to sound to most kids today, the world was a very different place. Anyway, I have plenty of other stories I could share. I shared this one to remind everyone to keep a very close eye on your kids, especially nowadays. This time things turned out alright, but that isn't always the case. I've been doing search and rescue for quite a while now. More specifically, I specialize in what is known as mountain rescue. I've worked all over, but I'm going to share my story about a rescue effort in Montana in the summer of 2002. Glacier National Park has many wonderful places to hike and many mountains to hike through. It's usually safe as long as you aren't too off the beaten path, but sometimes things don't go as planned. Search and rescue isn't something I ever thought I'd be in. Growing up, I was much more interested in football. That said, that all changed after spending time in the armed forces, and eventually, after getting out, landing a job with the park rangers. Anyway, I remember this search like it happened yesterday. It will stick with me for the remainder of my life. We got a call on a Saturday morning to search for a man in his 30s who had gone hiking while on vacation earlier in the week, but who hadn't returned home when he was supposed to. Apparently, he was supposed to meet with his folks for a family barbecue. At any rate, he'd been missing and they couldn't reach him, and being he had been hiking and climbing around the Glacier National Park, we started out there. It was fairly easy to find this gentleman's Jeep, still parked near the hiking trail, so we used that to get his scent, and it wasn't long before we were off. Search dogs running ahead, in search of this man. The search started off pretty hopeful as we tracked his progress on the hiking trail and eventually to the mountains. The dogs were quick at their work, and I remember thinking very quickly we'd probably find this guy fine, having stayed an extra day out in the mountains or on the trails, enjoying nature. It wouldn't have been unusual. The area is beautiful, and we've had cases of missing persons who were supposed to meet up with friends and family after a hike who simply forgot while being captured by the majestic beauty that was out there. I figured this was going to be another case like that, until our search dogs began going off the beaten path. The mountains around the park are great places to hike if you stay on the trail, but if you go off, it is very easy to find yourself lost, or potentially in a bad situation like falling and dying, or getting trapped out there. We usually recommend people who aren't experienced to stay on the trail. It had become very clear this man, for one reason or another, had gone off the trail. While not necessarily common, the thought that he may have run into a cougar or some larger animal had crossed my mind. According to his family, the man had only been hiking 2 times prior, so he wasn't likely to be very experienced. That said, sometimes less experienced hikers get in their head that they want more of an adventure, and so there was also a strong chance this young soul had wandered off the path in search of a thrill. Speculation aside, we started searching off the beaten path. It took a good few hours on foot to safely navigate even a mile through the area. We even called in a search chopper overhead to look through the area and see if they could spot anyone. After 24 hours went by, there was nothing. This worried everyone searching, myself included, greatly. After the first 24 hours, the likelihood of searching for a dead body becomes a much more possible reality. Still, I tried to put this out of my mind and did as the rest of the search team was and continued in our shifts. 24 turned to 48 and 48 turned to 72 hours. At this point, the family had been calling and constantly checked in with the worry, which they should rightfully have been doing. There are a few things as rough about search and rescue, or really any job where a person may be missing. It's hard to try to reassure with a brave face that you'll find someone's loved one when internally you realize the worst case scenario is likely what happened. It was 7 days into the search when we found a canteen and what looked like to be some sort of drop-off. It took us a while to work our way down, but we eventually found the missing man. I'm going to share this part to stress why it is important you stay on the trails if you aren't experienced. This young man had slipped while climbing a particularly treacherous area that he shouldn't have been in at all. He fell several feet, lost his canteen and landed, breaking his legs and arm on the way down, in an open area on the mountain. The man spent the remainder of his days starving and thirsty till his body gave out from shock and the lack of food and water, coupled with the injuries he sustained from the fall. Just imagine how horrific that would be, and how helpless this guy must have felt in his last moments. I was there when the unfortunate news was given to the family. It will always stick with me. The look of disbelief on the father's face and the pure agony on the mother's face as she screamed and cried over her now-deceased son. That will stay with me for the rest of my years. The saddest part of all this is this bright, happy young man could still be alive today if it were not for the choice to go off the trail. I'm not saying you never can or should, but you should never do something like that on a whim, and you should come well prepared. The young man in question wasn't prepared and didn't have the gear to wander off to where he went. Unfortunately, that cost him his life. My heart will forever be with his family, and this search will stick with me for the rest of my life. My name is Matt, and I've been doing search and rescue for 25 years. My specialization is in cave rescue. We aren't used all the time, but like any hobby or career, spelunkers go missing from time to time, and that's where we come in. Cave rescue is a lot different from other types of search and rescue. It's very dangerous and requires specialized training. We often search in very dark areas, and even with the help of lighting, it is quite easy to get lost, trapped, or, depending on the cave, even fall off a sudden drop. My story begins with a missing spelunker in the deserts of southern New Mexico. The man had been missing for a little over 24 hours when we got the call. Upon entering the cave, it didn't take long to notice something was off about this search. We found a flashlight neatly set out and just laying there. That was odd enough, but as we continued deeper into the cave, some of the search team began to get odd headaches, and a few even began to claim they were seeing or hearing things. Later, many of them will report seeing someone just out of their sight. They said they thought this person was female, but they could never tell for sure as everything was just on the edge of visibility and blurry. If that wasn't strange enough, we found a shirt just laying, once again, as though it had been neatly set out for us to find by someone who had, for whatever reason, decided they didn't need it anymore. The deeper we got, the weirder things got. Sometimes, the whole search team, myself included, would hear this music. It was one of the most pleasant sounds, and was accompanied by a woman humming. About 10 hours into our search, a few of our team members began to show signs of nausea. We are very careful and thorough about where we search and what might be in the cave or air. That was nothing to indicate that we should be getting sick. It got so bad at one point that we had to send a few people back out and have a few people stay back to join up with them when they finally made it back in. This took time, obviously, but as I was one of the leads, I pushed deeper, along with a few others. There are a few things as beautiful and also potentially frightening as caves. In a lot of ways, it really is like its own little world. I always like to think of different caves like planets in our solar system. They're all different, and many are deep enough that they could be thought of as their own dark worlds. It's a bit of a strange analogy, but that's just how I've always thought of them. Deeper we pushed ahead until we eventually found a trail of broken up, and in some cases, half-eaten food. It was as if whoever had been eating the food was only half into it or couldn't find something so they just kept mashing it up and discarding the food. It was a very odd sight. It didn't seem very logical, and this had us worried. If our missing spelunker was down here, and if they had begun acting irrationally for any reason, what could they be like when we found them? Would they be safe to deal with? Would they be a danger to themselves? These are all questions we had to consider, as it was important to the team to stay safe as well as the missing person. Eventually the trail of food stopped, and we found some climbing rope and gear. I pulled on the rope, which was attached to the anchor buried into the cave side. Pulling on it, the thing had some weight to it, but as I pulled further, I jumped back in horror at the sight of a bat. Its head was missing, tight to the opposite end of what appeared to be a cut rope. This was obviously a bad sign, and a sign of someone behaving completely erratically. I notified some of the guys to be careful and asked for a couple of them to come with me into the pit. The pit was another matter altogether. As we prepared our anchors and climbing gear, I looked down. If you didn't know any better, with as dark as it was, you'd swear you were staring into a bottomless pit. Things got stranger as we began our descent. The lower we got, the louder the sound of music became. We could hear a woman humming once again. As we got deeper, it sounded like many voices joined in like a choir. Along with this woman's voice, all of the voices were humming along with the woman, and the sound was so distinct. If you heard it, you wouldn't be able to deny for even a second that this was something you were actually hearing. We were all certain we heard it. After what seemed like forever, we reached the bottom of the pit. The second our feet touched the ground and we detached from the end of our lines, the air in the place grew more sinister. There was an almost suffocating dread that you actively had to mentally fight, that just hung in the air. It didn't seem at first like there was a reason for there to be outside of being in a dark pit. Still, this wasn't something new to us, so the fear that was trying to overtake the mind was unusual. It was almost like an entity all its own, aggressive in nature. The humming and music were louder than ever until we entered the only available open path ahead of us. That was when everything fell silent. I glanced at the other two following me and proceeded down a spiral, almost like a staircase. It wasn't a staircase, mind you, but a formation of rock that spiraled downward in a circle, much like a staircase might. There was an echo that grew louder between what sounded like bites, followed by something unintelligible. This repeated until we reached the bottom and noticed a trail of blood. Slowly, we pressed ahead. I remember shaking at the thought that we were down here with something or someone that was eating someone or something. All the horror movies I'd seen were starting to come to mind, but I tried to shake that and the oppressive fear before moving forward. Following the fresh blood trail, we eventually came upon some shorts and then a man hunched over, muttering gibberish to himself as he bit into something. Closer examination revealed the man was eating a once-living bat, head first. The man turned towards us and stood, blood still dripping from his teeth, smiling as he stared. I will never get this picture out of my head for the rest of my life, and at times I still have nightmares about this moment of finding the man. We tried to get some positive ID, but the man just stood there, motionless in his underwear, bat in hand, smiling and giggling to himself. We searched through the man's shorts and found a wallet that positively ID'd him as the missing man we were searching for. I made sure we had a set of eyes on him at all times. The man came with us without a fight. He kept muttering about how he needed the bats to keep her and the voices at bay. When the humming and music started again, on the way up, the man grew quiet and afraid, like a child who is afraid of the dark, but too afraid to turn on the light or move in fear that something that might just come for him. This guy seemingly imagined a monster might come out and kill him or steal him away, never to be seen again. When we reached the surface, the man shrieked in fear. It was though realization hit him and almost seemed like a totally different person. We took him to a hospital where he was checked out and kept for a few days to be on monitor. From what I hear, he was eventually let out, but he was told to follow up with a therapist. I feel they thought the man had some kind of mental breakdown, but I'm not sure what they said about him in all truth and honesty. The thing is though, we heard the voices, the humming. Many had strange headaches and I still have nightmares about the search. If this man was believed to have a form of psychosis or mental illness of some kind, why did we, a well-trained and veteran search team, have problems ourselves? I'm positive I heard the humming in the music. I'm positive something strange happened in that cave. I can't explain what or why, but I'm positive there is something in those caves. I've been a search and rescue person for over 20 years. I'm a sheriff, and my story isn't going to be some kind of terror-filled fuel ride. No, mine is about the devastating aftermath of an F5 tornado in Oklahoma in 1999. Some of you may remember it, but I'm also sure some of you are too young. An F5 tornado swept through Oklahoma in a particularly active summer. The damage was astronomical, especially by the standards of that time. The total destruction came to about $1 billion worth of damage. This tornado also had the greatest wind speeds ever recorded from a tornado at about 302 miles per hour. Just imagine what that is like for a second. Imagine the sheer terror of a behemoth that size coming your way. To further give you an idea of the sheer power and also strange nature of the storm, most tornadoes on average last no more than 10 minutes on the ground before disappearing entirely. This tornado lasted an hour and 25 minutes. The cost of damage was one thing, but the cost in lives was much worse. We lost 36 people that day and another 5 indirectly. There were also another 583 people injured by this anomaly of nature. Just about anything in the path of this monster was gone. I've never seen a thing like that to this day. That is saying a lot, as we get tornadoes all the time in Oklahoma. In the aftermath of the storm, we pulled bodies from the wreckage and destruction. We found injured and sick. I pulled a family screaming for help for hours from the wreckage of theirs and other homes, which buried them alive. They screamed, and when we finally got to them, it took well over a day to get them out from under the debris. I wish I could impress upon anyone listening just how bad this storm was. You expect destruction from a tornado, but for one this size to form and to last this long, it's unheard of. This thing literally blew towns off the map. If you need an idea of the sheer destruction, you can Google or even go to YouTube and look up 1999 F5 tornado Oklahoma or something similar. The kind of damage by this storm was something you might expect from a hurricane or some other natural disaster. I remember pulling a dog from the wreckage. We found many animals, some alive and some dead. In all my years doing this job, I've never been so deeply impacted and left in shock by the sheer amount of destruction one event can have. It's like one day your life is fine, and then a few hours later, you've lost everything. I apologize for rambling, but I guess why I wanted to share this story was to give you more of an idea of how badly things can get, and how, for those of us who do search and rescue, there are events that even leave us in shock. I also wanted to instill upon you that you should treat life preciously. You never know when something might happen that could change your life, or even take your life away. I remember there was one older woman who'd survived who kept looking at her cat Bootsy. I believe she called him. She said adamantly that Bootsy was still alive out there somewhere. She was sure of it. We were checking her out in an ambulance, and I remember trying to think of ways to break the news that Bootsy probably didn't make it, when suddenly, from the wreckage, this fat calico cat just comes trundling across the street, not a care in the world, and up to no good really, and runs right up to the lady. She was so elated, and I remember that being the first time we laughed since the storm. It was a lighter moment, but it kind of stuck with me as a result of how different it was to the insanity that had just happened around us. Surprisingly, most people had a very resilient spirit about the event. Many I talked to said they would rebuild and continue their lives from there. A lot has changed since 20 years ago, but we will never forget that tornado. I'll personally never forget the lives, both alive and dead, I assisted in pulling from the wreckage. It isn't discussed a lot, but search and rescue is a hard job. The disasters we see and lives lost take a toll on us. I know this wasn't one direct story, but I hope it gives a glimpse into the destruction caused by this tornado, and also just a brief look into some of the things search and rescue teams deal with or see. My heart will always go out to the families who lost loved ones in this disaster or any like it. If you take one thing from what I'm telling you, let it be that life is precious and everything can change in an instant. My name is Jack, and I've been with a civilian search and rescue unit for roughly 10 years. We mostly work in international waters and we see a lot of things, but the story that sticks out for me the most was the rescue of several workers from an oil rig. You might be asking how that sticks out to me, as we probably deal with that sort of thing fairly regularly, right? Well, the reason it sticks out to me is that I almost died while doing this. We received word at around 10 a.m. that morning that one of the oil rigs we are contracted through had an accident and the rig was on fire. We responded immediately and headed for the distressed. Upon arriving there, many of the workers were already on rafts and trying to distance themselves from the rig. I remember being in shock at how quickly the oil rig had been engulfed in flames. It was such a sight to see. It's crazy to see how fast fire can really spread, even on open water. I remember being in shock, and don't get me wrong, I realized oil was highly flammable, but the sheer size of this fire was something else. Anyway, we get there, and we start transferring people onto our boats and moving them safely. This rig is super close by us, and so we are moving back and forth, and all is going well thus far. We bring some of these men to safety, have medical workers checking them out, and head back to get more. Before you know it, we have the next batch and are transporting them again. I'm starting to think to myself this is going to be alright. The third time around we heard screaming. It's the head foreman, screaming from the top of his lungs and waving his arms, still on top of the oil rig. I'm thinking this can't get any worse, right? When the guy starts climbing down the side of one of the legs. We are telling him not to do it, and once he's ignoring us completely. About halfway down, I'm not sure if he lost his grip or just decided he was low enough, and jumped in the water. It seems like he purposely dived, judging by the way he braced himself for the impact. I immediately head out that direction and go looking for this guy. I get him, and he's miraculously okay, no injuries or anything. Anyway, we get back to the boat, and I'm like, good, I got this guy and he is safe, it's going to be okay. As my bad luck would have it, there's another explosion on the rig above us. Next thing I know, I feel a stabbing pain. This isn't a funny situation, but I remember laughing at myself. partially in shock, saying to my guys, "I think I got stabbed." Apparently I had said that a couple of more times with a smile on my face before collapsing. I think I was only smiling, as I was in shock and probably at a bit of disbelief. Also, it wasn't until I woke up later that I realized that a piece of shrapnel from the rig had actually passed through my gut. It had happened so fast I only felt a slight stabbing pain when in actuality it had gone straight through my body. I was bleeding out and they rushed me out of there and took care of me as best as they could. In the meantime, they were rounding up the remainder of the survivors. The good news is everyone lived. There were no casualties and very few injuries. The job was a complete success short of the whole being impaled by debris thing. I talk a bit lightly about this now, but it's because looking back, I couldn't help but laugh. I have a morbid sense of humor, and just how bad the day had been hadn't really hit me until I woke up in the hospital. I thought the job seemed routine. It turned out to be anything but. I thought we were about to leave and everything would be just fine, and it wasn't. I thought I'd merely been stabbed when it was much worse. I find that sort of irony a bit funny, but thankfully after a few surgeries, I was okay. Nothing vital was impacted, and I spent a bit of the next few weeks in the hospital, but could now look back on this and share it with you all. I've had some crazy rescues that didn't involve me getting injured, but none were quite like this. I was told later that an inch in any direction, I would have been a dead man. Looking back, it still doesn't feel real. I mean, I know what happened, and I remember most everything until collapsing, but it's just kind of crazy to me. Thanks for listening to these creepy and surely tragic search and rescue stories. If you enjoyed these stories, please help me out by hitting that like button as it helps me out a ton. If you're new to the channel, why not subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss a new video? I upload them almost every single day, and all things natural and supernatural. If you have a story you would like to share in a future video, whether it be a search and rescue story or something completely different, be sure to submit that at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story, as everybody would love to hear them here as well. If you guys didn't know, you can find your favorite Swamp Dweller stories on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, and pretty much every major podcast retailer that you can find. Definitely go there, leave me some reviews, and tell me what you think. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.